A rich tourist spat on a royal guard's face, believing their famous silence made them weak. But when this decorated veteran finally broke his stance, his response didn't just humble the man, it taught the world what true strength means. The summer sun beat down mercilessly on the grounds of Buckingham Palace, its golden rays reflecting off the ornate gates where hundreds of tourists gathered, phones raised high to capture their brush with British royalty. Among the sea of excited faces and chattering voices stood guard Thomas Blackwood, as still as the palace walls themselves, his red uniform pristine despite the sweltering August heat. At 29, Blackwood was no ordinary guardsman. 8 years of service to the crown had earned him more than just the right to wear the prestigious uniform of the Queen's Guard. 2 tours in Afghanistan had taught him the true meaning of discipline, his valor earning him commendations that now sat quietly in his modest London flat. But here, standing at attention before Buckingham Palace, he served a different kind of duty. Every morning, Blackwood would rise before dawn, spending 3 meticulous hours preparing his uniform, each button polished to a mirror shine, every strap and buckle aligned with military precision. To some, it might seem excessive for what tourists often dismissed as mere ceremonial duty, but Blackwood knew better. The uniform he wore carried centuries of tradition, each crease and fold a testament to the unwavering dedication of those who came before him. It's not just about standing still, he would later recall of that fateful afternoon. When we put on this uniform, we become living symbols of something greater than ourselves. Every tourist photo, every child's wave, every attempted joke, we face it all with the dignity this position demands. On an average day, Blackwood would encounter hundreds of tourists, their cameras flashing and children pointing. Most were respectful, some were amusing, and a few would try to provoke a reaction, a time-honored game that most guards had learned to take in stride. But this particular Thursday afternoon would prove different. Among the usual crowd of sightseers, a group of American tourists was making their way toward his post, led by a man whose expensive polo shirt and designer sunglasses couldn't quite mask his air of entitlement. The time was 2:30 p.m., the sun at its highest and the crowd at its thickest. None of the excited tourists snapping their photos could have guessed they were about to witness a moment that would challenge the very foundations of duty, discipline, and dignity. Not even Blackwood, who had maintained his composure through 8 years of service, through war and peace, through rain and shine, could have predicted how the next 17 minutes would test every ounce of his training. As the group of Americans drew closer, the air seemed to grow heavier with tension. In his years of service, Blackwood had never once broken character. Not in the worst weather, not under the most aggressive provocations, but as he caught sight of a young man approaching Kevin Reynolds, though Blackwood didn't know his name yet, something felt different. The man's expensive polo shirt and practiced smirk spoke of privilege and entitlement, a combination Blackwood had seen too many times before. As Reynolds sauntered closer with an all-too-familiar air of superiority, Blackwood would soon discover that every man, no matter how disciplined, has his limits. Kevin Reynolds wasn't accustomed to being ignored back in Texas. His family's oil money had always guaranteed him the attention he felt he deserved at the prestigious Dallas Country Club. Waiters would materialize at the slightest gesture in board meetings. Executives twice his age hung on his every word. Even here in London, his first-class flights, 5-star hotels, and exclusive restaurant reservations had maintained that comfortable bubble of difference he'd come to expect. But now, standing before the stoic figure of Guard Blackwood, Reynolds faced something his wealth couldn't influence: genuine, unmovable dignity. The morning had started typically enough for Reynolds. A champagne breakfast at the Ritz, where the maitre d' had fawned over him appropriately. A shopping spree at Harrods, where attendants had rushed to offer him private viewing rooms. But as the day wore on and the drinking continued, a familiar restlessness had begun to stir within him, that nagging need to prove himself, to assert his importance in increasingly dramatic ways. "Hey, look at this guy," Reynolds called out to his friends, his voice carrying the distinctive drawl of old money, Texas. "Bet you $50 I can make him crack." His three companions, already recording with their phones, snickered in anticipation. They'd spent the morning pub crawling through London's finest establishments, their American Express black cards opening doors that would have remained firmly closed to lesser mortals. And now, with liquid courage coursing through their veins, they were ready for what Reynolds called some real entertainment. The first attempts were predictable enough. Reynolds posed beside Blackwood for selfies, making exaggerated faces and throwing peace signs. "Come on, buddies, smile for the camera." His friends laughed, encouraged by the growing attention from other tourists who had stopped to watch. A small crowd began to form, their own phones raised to capture whatever might unfold. A street vendor nearby slowly pushed his cart away. Sensing the brewing trouble with the instinct of someone who'd seen similar scenes before, Blackwood remained motionless, his eyes fixed straight ahead. In his mind, he recited the oath he'd taken years ago, letting the familiar words wash over him like armor. He'd faced worse, much worse. The scars on his left shoulder from that firefight in Helmand Province were testament to that. He could still recall the whistle of bullets, the weight of his wounded comrade as he dragged him to safety, the grit of sand between his teeth as he'd called in air support. This was nothing. Just another tourist who'd had too much to drink and forgotten his manners. But Reynolds was just getting started, emboldened by his audience and frustrated by Blackwood's composure. He stepped closer, the expensive scotch on his breath mingled with designer cologne as he invaded the guard's personal space. "What's with the funny hat, man? Did you lose a bet?" He reached up as if to touch the bare skin cap, stopping just short, even in his inebriated state. Some small part of him remembered the warnings about physically interfering with the guards. His hand hovered there, trembling slightly as if testing the boundaries of his own courage. A middle-aged woman in the crowd spoke up, her British accent sharp with disapproval. "Young man, show some respect." She clutched her handbag tighter, her knuckles white with indignation, but her words only seemed to fuel Reynolds's determination. He turned to the crowd with an exaggerated bow, playing to his growing audience like a seasoned performer who'd finally found his stage. "Respect for what's standing there like a mannequin," Reynolds scoffed, his designer sunglasses catching the afternoon sun. The Ray-Bans cost more than some people's monthly salary, but they couldn't mask the emptiness in his eyes. "My tax dollars probably pay for this whole circus." The historical inaccuracy of his statement might have been amusing if his tone hadn't been so bitter, so deliberately provocative. A few American tourists in the crowd exchanged embarrassed glances as if trying to distance themselves from their countrymen's behavior. Blackwood remained still, but his mind was active. He noticed everything. The way Reynolds's friends had spread out to film from different angles, the uncomfortable shuffling of other tourists, the concerned glances from a palace security officer in the distance. 8 years of military service had taught him to observe, to assess, to prepare. He noted the slight sway in Reynolds' stance, the forced nature of his laugh, the way his right hand kept clenching and unclenching, signs of someone working themselves up to do something stupid. Something in Reynolds' demeanor was different from the usual troublemakers. There was a calculated edge to his actions, a deliberate escalation that set off warning bells in Blackwood's mind. The sun had shifted position, casting long shadows across the palace grounds. A cool breeze carried the distant chimes of Big Ben. Blackwood had been standing at his post since dawn, his muscles trained to maintain perfect stillness despite the fatigue. He'd learned this discipline in military training, perfected it during countless ceremonies, and now it served as both his armor and his weapon. "Maybe he's broken," Reynolds announced, moving to stand directly in front of Blackwood, his expensive loafers scuffed against the pavement as he steadied himself. "Hey, robot, anyone home?" He waved his hand in front of Blackwood's face, close enough that the guard could smell the expensive scotch on his breath. Malin, 25. If Blackwood had to guess, not that it made the disrespect any more palatable. The crowd had grown larger now, a mix of entertained onlookers and concerned observers. Some had stopped filming, their discomfort evident in their lowered phones and averted gazes. A young couple hurried their children away, shooting disapproving looks over their shoulders. Reynolds' friends, however, were ecstatic. "This is going viral for sure," one called out, adjusting his camera angle for better coverage. He wore a Rolex that caught the sunlight with each movement. "Do the thing we talked about, Kev." Their excitement had the desperate edge of people trying too hard to believe they were having fun. A young girl, no more than 7 or 8, tugged at her mother's sleeve. Her ice cream cone was melting, forgotten in her hand as she watched the scene unfold with wide-eyed concern. "Mommy, why is that man being so mean?" The question, innocent and clear in the afternoon air, caused several onlookers to shift uncomfortably. A father pulled his son closer, whispering what appeared to be a lesson about respect. But Reynolds either didn't hear or chose to ignore it, too far gone in his performance to register the impact of his actions. Instead, he turned to his audience, arms spread wide like a showman. His polo shirt, damp with sweat despite its pristine brand name, clung to him as he swayed slightly. "Ladies and gentlemen, I think it's time we found out if these guards are actually human." His voice had taken on a theatrical quality, but there was something ugly beneath the performance, a desperate need to prove something, to assert dominance over this symbol of authority and discipline that stood before him, unflinching and unimpressed. It was the same tone he used in board meetings when belittling junior executives, at restaurants when sending back perfectly good wine, and in life when trying to fill the void his wealth couldn't touch. Blackwood felt his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. In Afghanistan, he'd learned to read people, to sense when a situation was about to escalate beyond the point of no return. That same instinct was screaming at him. Now he could feel the weight of his ceremonial rifle, the press of his bare skin cap, the eyes of centuries of tradition watching through him. But his training held firm. He remained motionless, his eyes fixed on a point in the distance. Even as Reynolds moved closer, even as the air grew thick with tension and anticipation, in his peripheral vision, he could see other tourists backing away, creating a circle of space around what was quickly becoming a moment of reckoning. What happened next would test not just Blackwood's training, but the very essence of what it meant to wear the uniform of the Queen's Guard. Reynolds, his expensive polo shirt now dampened with sweat from the afternoon heat, circled Blackwood like a predator testing its prey. But in his alcohol-fueled mind, he failed to recognize one crucial detail. He wasn't the hunter here. 8 years of military service had made Blackwood acutely aware of every movement, every subtle shift in the air around him. "You know what I think?" Reynolds announced to his increasingly uncomfortable audience. "I think these guys are just scared. Scared to move, scared to speak, scared to be real." His words slurred slightly at the edges, betraying the liquid courage that fueled his bravado. They hide behind tradition because they're too weak to face reality. Blackwood's mind flashed briefly to a morning in Helmand Province, where he'd held his position under heavy fire for 3 hours to protect a wounded colleague. Weak was not a word that featured in his vocabulary. Reynolds leaned in closer, his designer sunglasses now hanging loosely from his collar. "What do they even do here? Anyway, stand around like statues while the world laughs at them." He turned to his friends, who continued filming despite the visible discomfort on their faces. Even they seemed to sense that a line was about to be crossed. An elderly gentleman stepped forward from the crowd, his RAF veteran pin glinting in the sunlight. "Son, that's enough. You've had your fun." But Reynolds was beyond hearing reason. The combination of expensive scotch, wounded pride, and an audience had created a perfect storm of poor judgment. "You want to know what I think of your precious tradition?" Reynolds' face contorted with a mixture of contempt and desperate need for attention. Time seemed to slow as he gathered the saliva in his mouth. Later, dozens of videos would capture this moment from various angles, but none would fully convey the sudden, horrified silence that fell over the crowd. The spittle landed on Blackwood's cheek just below his right eye for a fraction of a second. Even the birds seemed to stop singing. The crowd's collective gasp created a vacuum of sound, as if all of London held its breath. Reynolds stood there, a triumphant smirk playing across his face, clearly expecting something, a reaction, a breakdown, a victory. What he got instead was far more terrifying. Blackwood didn't move. Saliva slid down his cheek like a tear, but his face stayed as still as the palace behind him. One man swayed with drink and bravado, the other stood like an oak, dignity intact. Despite the insult, security rushed in, but it was the measured tread of Guard Captain Harrison that froze Reynolds. His friends lowered their phones, realizing this was no longer a joke. For the first time, Blackwood's eyes shifted, locking on Reynolds with the same focus that had tracked enemies in Afghanistan. There was no rage there, only the weight of tradition and duty. "Guard Blackwood, stand down," Harrison ordered. For Blackwood, that single command meant he could finally move. He pivoted, saluted. "Sir, permission to address the situation?" "Granted." He raised a white-gloved hand and calmly wiped the spit away, then turned to the crowd. "You see this uniform?" His voice carried across the courtyard. "Before I earned it, I served 2 tours in Afghanistan. I've watched brothers die defending the values you mock. This isn't a costume. It's a symbol of discipline, honor, and sacrifice." He swept the watching faces. "We are not statues. We feel every insult. But we stand firm because some things are bigger than our comfort or ego. Some traditions deserve respect, even if you don't understand them." Reynolds shrank under the words. "You wanted a viral video," Blackwood said quietly. "Congratulations. You've shown the world not our weakness, but why we must stand here, to keep dignity alive in the face of ignorance." He saluted Harrison once more and resumed his post. The mark on his cheek dried and disappeared, but the lesson did not. Real strength, people would say later, looks exactly like that.